Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Meager, Policy Editor of Capital Monitor, and it is my pleasure to be chairing this webinar in partnership with Clarity AI, titled ESG Backlash, a Side Effect of Confusion. So just a few quick housekeeping points before we kick off. We would really like the audience to get involved, so please submit your questions for our speakers at any point during the session via the Ask a Question button on your screen. Please also use the hashtags ESG and Capital Monitor when posting about the event on social media. We would really love to hear your comments and feedback. So I'm really pleased to be joined by an excellent lineup of speakers today. They are Angel Agudo, Vice President of Product and a member of the board at Clarity AI, James Alexander, CEO of the UK Sustainable Investment Forum, and Damien Hansey, Managing Director for Performance, Risk and Analytics at Confluence. Thank you so much for agreeing to take part. So sustainable finance has obviously experienced exponential growth over the past decade, and so-called ESG aligned assets now make up a third of all global assets. There have always been detractors, but in the past 6 months, maybe a year, these voices have gotten quite a bit louder. From ex-BlackRock executive Tarek Fancy's fairly explosive takedown of ESG itself last year to The Economist's controversial summer cover story arguing that ESG metrics should be boiled down to literally just measuring emissions, criticism feels like it's coming from all corners, which it isn't. As usual, the most extreme examples exist in the US, where a handful of Republican lawmakers have pushed back against the SEC's work on climate disclosure and are working to introduce dozens of explicitly anti-ESG investing bills at state level. In the US, at least, ESG appears to be caught firmly in the culture wars. So my first question is this. I'm going to go to you first, Damien, for the US view. Is it your view that these ESG detractors are acting in good faith or not? And how can we kind of separate that genuine constructive criticism about something that maybe we haven't labeled that well from political posturing?
Thanks, Lizzie. And I'll say from the U.S., good morning and good afternoon to everyone on today. So it's, of course, an explosive question. I want to unpack it a little bit. So I think it's a little bit unfair to say that U.S. states are passing anti-ESG legislation. I don't think that's actually what they're doing. So my short answer is, are they acting in good faith? Many of them, most of them, almost all of them are. There are, of course, going to be actors who aren't acting in good faith. But I don't think it's a genuine attempt to act in bad faith, right, across the board. So what do I mean? So, for example, Florida, which, of course, is in the news today because of the Category 4 hurricane that just is ripping through that state. It's ironic that Florida is one of the states that is passing legislation restricting the applicability of ESG in funds, but not anti-ESG. So I think that is an important point of clarification. What does that actually mean? It means that states that are taking a conservative approach are saying that the fiduciary responsibility of the investment management group of public pension plans, for example, can only take into account the upside potential growth of the fund, the financial well-being of the participants. It is not saying you're not allowed to invest in ESG. Now, it clearly does target ESG because that's not necessarily a prime directive for increasing returns. And you can certainly argue that if you ignore ESG, you're going to ignore material financial risks like damage from a hurricane, to bring that point back. So it's, yes, the US is certainly polarized and ESG is in the crosshairs. It is much more controversial a topic in the US than it is in Europe. For example, there is what I think of as a healthy debate in the US about what is actually causing climate change. Why do I think that's healthy? Because I think debates are healthy in general. In this case, I think the science is quite clear that it is caused by human activity. However, there are prominent scientists who disagree with that. So it is more controversial here than in Europe for sure. We are lagging behind Europe. We will catch up at some point, I believe. So short answer, I do believe most people are acting in good faith.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you touched upon what my follow-up question was going to be, was exactly, isn't that just kind of telling fiduciary managers to ignore this huge category of risks that they have always had to think about? I just briefly want to talk about this, The Economist's proposition last year that you boil ESG down to literally just measuring emissions. And James, I know that you kind of wrote a response to that. How helpful is that argument?
I mean, well, not at all. I think, we've got to think about this in the round. We've got to think about the enormous range of elements that we're trying to work through. Now, just in, to what Damien was just saying, I actually think this backlash has got quite a lot of bad actors involved in it. And I think that a lot of the funding from this backlash is coming from very dubious sources that I'm sure you could link back to fossil fuels. There is, a part of this feels very strongly like a kind of last gasp of the fossil fuel industry to try and avoid being starved of capital that it claims it will need in order to continue going as a going concern. In an era where renewables and other forms of energy are enormously cheaper to put together and to develop, they're no longer risky assets. They're well proven, they're well tested. They work, they drive things forward, and they can grow the economy in a really strong. The reality is the reasons why you would be investing in the future of energy, the future of sustainability are so multiple now. It's completely gone beyond any kind of interest around climate. And yet what we're now seeing is, these Republican lawmakers that I think, realistically, very many of them are, we know the American political system is washed with lobby money. Very many of them, I think, are fully influenced by the money that's flowing through from fossil fuel companies who are, clearly panicking about this, clearly thinking that, the more people consider the risks of their investments, the more they realize that making investments in fossil fuels is a bad idea. That is the reality of where we're getting to now. And I think that to be in a situation where lawmakers are jumping in to tell people that the way that they need to invest and what risks they need to not consider by law, to not be considering a whole range of risks that are not even questionable, they are going to have a real material impact on the value of these funds over the long term. Bearing in mind, we're talking about pension funds. The pension fund isn't existing for today or tomorrow. It's existing for 10, 20, 30 years future. In that time period, these enormous ESG risks that we're seeing are absolutely going to come to pass. And I think that, realistically, the people that are going to be most affected by this are, predominantly the pension savers and others, the kind of ordinary people in these states whose funds are at risk because they are not, their fund managers are not being allowed to look at the things that they need to look at as normal fiduciaries of capital. And of course, in the process, it also harms all of us, because this is a lot of these capital flows are what are causing the harm that we're seeing to the planet, and the floods and hurricane that we're just seeing, which is climate change enhanced hurricane that we're seeing in Florida right now, that just wiped out all the power supply to Cuba. The fact that last month, a third of Pakistan was underwater. The consequences of climate change and the scale of it are becoming ever clearer by the day. And, what is incumbent on us and on policymakers is to be using all the tools in our arsenal to make sure that we are advancing and not making this problem worse. And one of the key tools is flows of capital, and particularly flows of private capital that can have a big impact. And so, unfortunately, this ESG backlash, I don't think people are acting in good faith. I think if people really look at it, objectively, to see the scale of the problem and the solutions and the way that this is encouraging capital to move is very problematic. And to your question about The Economist, I think The Economist got it completely wrong. ESG is about, and it's even about this kind of broad understanding of what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is, looking fundamentally at what the different range of risks are for capital, which anybody who is investing capital should be thinking about. That is what I would expect from my fund manager, from my pension fund manager, from anybody else that's investing my capital, to be considering. And so to say that we should actually avoid looking at things like social issues, to avoid looking at any of the other environmental issues that we're talking about, like deforestation, or air quality, water pollution, species loss, these things are massively impacting to the world in a very negative way, and cause finance to be unsustainable. And what do we talk about when we say sustainable finance? We're talking about finance that cannot continue to grow in the way that it's going. That is unsustainable. And so, what we're looking at and what we're thinking about is using ESG as a tool to determine the long-term future sustainability, therefore viability of the capital that we're investing.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I've kind of briefly touched upon loads of subjects there. So I do want to talk about the increase in, I guess, anti-greenwashing legislation. So kind of rules on the other side, because I don't think it's a coincidence that, sticking with the US example very briefly, that the year that the SEC starts thinking about climate risk and disclosure seriously, that is when, you're starting to see dozens of these laws being rolled out. Angel, what is the connection there between regulators kind of wading into this, and obviously the EU is much further ahead than the US, and then this backlash kind of coming about now?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for making this possible, and all for being part of this. Let me connect briefly to the previous question, because it's difficult not to engage with that question, right? So I would like to contribute quickly with that. And I would try to make it in as much simple terms as I could, just basically because I believe part of all this backlash and even the confusion is basically about the communication, how we communicate this idea about ESG. So when I hear this message about, so we don't want to include ESG into the financial analysis, to me, it sounds exactly the same as if you were saying, we are not going to include the credits of the companies to analyze their credit ratings. We are not going to include the status of the manufacturers, for example, or the machines that they have to produce the products that they provide. Or we are not going to include where the stores are located to see if they are going to be able to have better future. Is this reasonable to anyone? No, you just want to understand, basically because you want to understand, due to fiduciary duties, how feasible this business was, how sustainable this business is going to be in the future. And you want to include as much information as you can there. I don't even want to get into the debate about how climate risk is so close or so far, and there are different opinions coming from different scientists or whatever. I have my own opinion, but I don't even want to get into that one. But listening from someone that there is, for example, and as Em was mentioning, there is not a link between the turnover of the employees and how the company is going to work in the future, when 70% of all the key companies in the world are much more intangible today than they were in the future, in the past. So basically, they are based on brains working together, on minds thinking together. And basically, if that people don't want to go to that company, they are not going to be working well in the future. Or governance dimensions. So if you don't have a good governance in the company, you don't think that is not going to affect you. If you have cases of corruption, you only have to see the news to see how corruption is affecting the markets, and above all, which is the important thing, the health of the company. So regardless of your opinion, and focus on the idea of the fiduciary duty, it is something that you as an investor need to take into account, to consider or not to consider things that you believe are going to be risky for the company. It doesn't mean that you need to use that information for sure because you are including ESG dimensions. It is that you need to have and put together all the tools and the information that you can capture to make your best judgment in terms of the companies that you invest. So that is the way that I see it, and I was trying to clarify and to make it as simple as possible, because this is where, if it is good faith or bad faith, again, I don't want to get into that. It's more clarity what I look for, right? Is making this message very, very simple. Getting into how the regulation can get into this. So I believe regulatory frameworks, what can help is in both directions, I would say, for the investors, for the people who are putting the money there, and for the companies that receive their money. For the investors, clarifying the terms, at least understanding and using the same information, standard information that let you know exactly if companies are good or bad in quantitative terms and in specific metrics that you can compare. And that is very positive, because otherwise we start talking about things that are intangible, that are not measurable, and definitely a debate about that is not useful. It's much more useful when you have ways to measure that and to make it explicit. For the companies as well, so when we talk about greenwashing, and I would open the question as well, is that good faith or bad faith? For companies, we are talking about a tremendous change, only if you take into consideration the measurement part. You need to take into account many other things that you were not considering before. And that is a change as big as it could be part of the digital transformation that they have been suffering from the last years. So this means that by using regulation, by standardizing the frameworks, by clarifying the metrics that you need to report, you facilitate as well the work for the companies to avoid getting into something that could be considered as greenwashing, regardless of it that it was done in good or bad faith. That is the way that I say.
So Angel, you make some, I think, very good points. One of the things that I think we all need to realize is the legislation that's coming out captures headlines because it's obviously how can you possibly do that type reaction. It only affects the public pension plans in the fund. It's not telling investors in the fund what to do. So when you look at it from a total AUM perspective, it is a drop in the bucket that's affected by this. Now it is headline worthy, and that's why we've spent the last 16 minutes discussing that. But I think it's important to realize that there's a fundamental difference between how Europe goes about thinking about, and acting on ESG, and how America does. Confluence serves clients in both continents, and we have very different clientele in both areas, both from an acceptance of regulation into the investment process. Europeans, by and large, are okay with the idea that a regulator regulates, and Americans, by and large, are not okay with being told what to do or what not to do. Now, the drive for ESG, the demand for ESG measurement, analytics, et cetera, in Europe predominantly is through regulation. The demand in North America predominantly is from ground. It's a grassroots investor demand, right? And just to put the headlines in perspective, yes, there are some states that are doing some things that a lot of us find controversial. There are a lot of states that are actually mandating ESG be part of the investment process, which to the American ear might actually sound like overstretching. How dare you tell us what to include or not to include? I agree with you. It's for the investor to decide where and what to consider. That is part of the investment process. So I think there are some significant differences in how people think about it, how they go about doing it. I mentioned that Europe is ahead of the US because I think regulation will come to the US. It will be slow, but the demand right now for ESG, what we're seeing in ESG services, is investor driven. And I think that, because of the plethora of different measurements and the plethora of different regulations in the European market, we do have quite a bit to talk about in terms of clarity and confusion of what exactly is a good or bad ESG company. All right, I'll wrap up by saying, James, you were talking about, obviously it's not good to invest in fossil fuel companies. I'm going to point out that the company formerly known as British Petroleum, now known as BP, is the world's largest fossil fuel refiner, manufacturer, seller, et cetera. And therefore, it's obviously a very bad company from an ESG perspective. It also happens to be the single largest investor in green technology in the world. So it's obviously a very, very good ESG company. Well, which is it, right? And that I think is a good example of how complex this stuff really is, and how it can't be summarized in one measurement, right? is deep, complex, and therefore lots and lots of opportunity for clarifying information to be spread.
And that's a really great point that I do want to pick up on. I think ESG scores is a good place to kind of move on to next, because I do wonder if kind of we've all been talking about similar but not the same things, and that's part of what's got us into this mess. I think that, I don't know, is it possible that, I think it's probably likely, that trying to come up with kind of one score or one number for a company that does thousands of different things, and whether they are a kind of a good ESG company or not, is that kind of what's got us into this mess? And do we need to be more careful about how we talk about this? Does anyone have a solution?
Well, I mean, I'll jump in, Lizzie, if that's all right. I mean, you know, I think, yeah. I mean, we are. What are we trying to do with these ESG scores and ratings? And first of all, you know, we've got to distinguish between what is data, which is data that flows from companies, and Helen and Damien, you both do a lot of work dealing with data. And then what happens is that data gets put into a kind of black box, and then out the other end comes a rating or a score or a set of scores. And at that point, that's no longer data. That's an opinion. And I think this is the bit that we've very much kind of tried our best to simplify what is something very complicated, but in the process of simplifying it, we've left it open to criticism, which is partly our own fault for trying to kind of pretend that this rating score is more than an opinion. Because what we're doing, and the reason why it's an opinion, is because we are taking about 1,000 different data points which relate to everything from how well a company is governed, and the makeup of its board, through to the missions of a company, through to the working practices of its employees and its supply chain. And we're trying to take all of those things one by one, give them scores with imperfect data sets, decide which is more important than another one, and then somehow build all that together into a rating that comes out, you know, a single number or a score that comes out the other end. It's no wonder that every agency that's trying to do this is coming up with different numbers and different answers, and that some agencies have got red lines. You know, so one of the big criticisms we saw earlier this year was Elon Musk saying, you know, how can it be right that Tesla is ranked lower than ExxonMobil? And, you know, the answer to that question is, well, it depends on your opinion of what's more important in your company. Do you think that a terribly governed company, which Tesla, definitely is an example of, where its stock price can go down by 20% based on one tweet from its chief executive, through to a company that clearly is quite well governed, has been, you know, established strong governance and other practices. You know, so those are some of the decisions that people making these ratings and scores have to come up with an answer to. You can't just fluff that. You can't kind of pretend that's not a decision you have to make. You have to, because you have to give that a score. And so again, it's no surprise that all this is different. So what we've created is this system of oversimplification, and it's almost not giving the market the full picture of just how complicated this is. And it's not, you know, we're trying to boil down every single impact the company has or risk the company has from a non-financial perspective in one single number, and we're trying to pretend that's a very easy exercise to do, and of course it never is going to be, and not particularly not helped by incomplete data sets and imperfect data. So, you know, that is the big problem that we've got here. I think we need to be a bit more open and a bit more honest and say this is not perfect. We're a developing industry, we're an emerging industry. We need a bit more data to come from corporates. We need a bit more clarity on what's going on inside those analyses that take place to give out those rating scores in the first place. We need to make sure that there aren't conflicts of interest, and we need to make sure that the data providers are you know, working in the right for the right interests. And then that way, I think if we're a bit more open about the fact that this is all moving forwards and developing, will give more confidence, I think, not just to the market, but to investors themselves, who I think, you know, we do see greenwashing, we do see bad actors in this space. We want to make sure that people don't lose confidence in this entire industry. And then just coming back to a few things, Damien, that you said, that I think are important just to touch on. You know, you talked about BP, and I think there's a, you know, very, very important question. You know, and maybe part of the ratings, we need to start thinking about our a company in a process of transition. Is that transition real? Do we trust it? Is it marketing hype? Right now we're getting on UK television, we're getting bombarded with adverts from Shell saying that, that all they talk about are the green side of what Shell's doing and plug-in chargers and everything else. Now, that may well be a big part of their business going forwards. But, what we've got to do as investors is to look at their transition plan. Do we trust that it's going to happen? Do we trust that it's going to put that company into a position where it's, no longer causing environmental harm, but actually more importantly, in a position from an economic investment perspective, in a position where it continues to have clients and customers and continues to be able to make sales going forward without the enormous risk that it currently has, which is that all of the fossil fuel industry is going to be regulated out of existence eventually if the world is to stay on its net zero trajectory. And so therefore, what is left of a company like BP? Now, in my opinion, a company like Exxon appears to be taking a path which is suggesting of, we'll just keep digging until we're told not to, and then we'll just pack up and go home. That feels like that's where that's going. Now, to me, that's an unacceptable risk to have in a portfolio. But I think, these are the things that need to be considered. And so, it's about where are the regulations coming from? Is it regulators or is it investors? I think, to be honest, in Europe, we're seeing it being both. We're also seeing it being staff. We're seeing it being politically driven. We're seeing managers and directors and C-suite of companies, sort of saying we believe that being a sustainable firm is the right place for us to be in the future, not just because we want to, do the right thing for the environment and for people, but actually because that is where the business opportunity is for the future. That is where our company needs to go to be a viable company in the future. So James, it's about this transition.
I think there's no question the demographics are on that side, right? When you slice any population, whether it's in America, in Europe, in Asia, and you look at people under 50, under 40 versus people over 50 or over 40, you get very, very different views about ESG, right? And there's simply no question that the future of industry, the future of investment is pointing very, very strongly towards ESG. You touched on the complexity and what I'm going to call oversimplification in attempting to give an ESG number, singular number, right? By analogy, right? If you went to your doctor and you blamed your doctor for the fact that your blood pressure measure, right? That's actually two numbers. Your temperature, your weight, one number did not predict you had cancer or anything else like that. That's an obviously absurd situation. But that's the situation we largely find ourselves when we try to oversimplify. E, S, and G measure three different things. I'm going to say using three different measures and units. It's like trying to add temperature to speed. It just doesn't make sense, right? They are measuring different things. We put an arbitrary score of 0 to 10 or 1 to 100 or whatever you want on there. But I think my solution to the problem is twofold. One, recognition that yes, let's make it as simple as possible, but not oversimplified. Simple as possible. There is an oversimplification threshold. And unfortunately with ESG, that threshold is actually pretty low. We need to get pretty granular to really understand what's going on. The other solution is transparency. Increased transparency. I think the disclosure regulation in Europe is helping a lot, especially around that education and getting investors to be more savvy about what's underneath ES and G, what makes those up, what's important, what's not important. We're seeing the same thing. Confluence is seeing the same thing in North America, where there's a lot of confusion, but there's also a lot of lessons learned from our own industry, from previous experiences. For example, global financial crisis. I remember every headline in 2007, 2008 was pointing at VAR. Why didn't VAR predict the global financial crisis? Give me a break. How can any one number predict anything, right? It's a complex system, and we need that disclosure. We need that transparency. Now, Europe is driving it through regulation. America is driving it largely from investors, that groundswell. But that transparency is going to open up a lot more questions, answers. It is an immature industry, right? It's been 15 years. It needs to go through that maturation process. We're very impatient. We want that to be done yesterday. We're on our way there. And I think transparency and recognition of don't try to oversimplify are two critical ingredients into that. At least that's what we're seeing from our clients.
Maybe if I may, Lisa, so very interesting topic. Well, first thing I have to say, I'm so glad to hear from James and Damien that what we need in the market is more clarity, because I could not agree more, right? So this is obvious, but I completely agree with your points, right? So I like what Damien said, because this is an example that I use often. Imagine that you go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, so I am analyzing your health and you have a score of 70, so you can go home. You would say, wait, but what 70 means? So does it mean that on average all my organs are good, or it means that my heart is very good but my lung is very bad, right? Because, by the way, there are many material organs in the body if you think about it, right? So there are not so many things that you can survive without. And this is kind of what we are analyzing here, right? So first, all those numbers refer to risk, and it is the very first thing that we need to clarify. We started the conversation talking about risk analysis. Those ESG risk scores, or the ESG scores that we have today in the market, they want to measure risk. And this is an important point to underline, because even you can hear from people that they cannot understand how a company that is supposed to be bad, depending how you measure that, is included as a top ESG player. Well, first, because of that, right? Because you are trying to analyze how ESG is affecting that. And James mentioned the point about Tesla. So our CEO, Rebecca Minghella, she sent a letter that was published in the Guardian, replying to Elon Musk about this, that I believe was pretty clarifying what is this different. But secondly is this point that you mentioned about, so this is super complex, and this is not necessarily about having this top number, but having the ability to get into the problems, as if you were the doctor. Because, by the way, as an asset manager, you are kind of the doctor, trying to understand if there's a problem there, or if there's going to be a problem in the future, or if it is today a problem, but that problem is not going to be there in the future, basically. Topics that you mentioned right now about how is the company looking today, how is the transition of the company looking, and if this risk that might happen today, and that's why due to this analysis, you might look bad in one dimension, but by reinvesting, changing your business, changing your processes and so on, you're going to be much better in the future. It means that you might be allowed to invest in a company that doesn't look good today, but you can prove and demonstrate that it's going to look better in the future. Because, by the way, there is no incentive coming to the fiduciary duty about investing in a company that doesn't look good. And even though you're going to invest, because you have at least a hypothesis that this company is going to be better in the future. I hope we are going to move, I guess, at some point talking more about the impact dimension, which is a totally different thing, totally different topic, and where the conversation made sense, right? So there it might be more intentional and more interesting, maybe if you have in the audience more people within the wealth management side, the banking side, the final customer side, interested in showing the people that are putting the money there, how by investing in these companies, you are contributing positively or negatively to something, which is a different debate. And it is very important to differentiate.
And is it almost kind of patronizing to imply that investors aren't looking beyond these top line scores anyway? Obviously, one score for one company is kind of, it doesn't really make sense. But I mean, who are they really for? Like, surely all investors are kind of thinking about this beyond just a number.
No, that's a great question. It goes to the interpretation of what do these scores actually mean, right? There are, and it's a little bit surprising, right? Potentially. So the score is not designed. I'm talking broadly, averaging over the vendor space of ESG ratings. Full disclosure, Confluence has ESG ratings of our own, and we import a lot of data from a lot of different vendors. So we've got experience with a lot of different methodologies for computing scores. The by and large, a naive interpretation of these scores is, high ESG score means it's good for the planet, or high E score means it's good for the planet. That's not what the methodologies actually try to do. Most of them, not all, but most of them take an approach that says higher scores indicate that this company will financially benefit from or won't be financially penalized by the regulatory/investment outlook over some time period horizon based on E, S, and G. It has the wherewithal to financially benefit or not financially lose from that. A low score means it's going to suffer financially. So it's a financial indicator. Some of the vendors take a risk approach. So is this a high risk, low risk from an ESG perspective? We did some research about a year and a half ago about the relationship between ESG scores and outperformance in the market. Because one would think that over the long term, high ESG companies should outperform the market. And in fact, a lot of studies do actually show that. And we showed the same thing. A big chunk of it is kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. People put money into ESG because the political climate is such that, hey, that's the right thing to do. I want to put my money there. Back to demographics, younger people tend to put more money into ESG funds here in the US and in Europe than older people. And there's a momentum-like characteristic to ESG today. So momentum as a fundamental equity factor, right? People tend, stocks do out. Recent performance is an indicator of very, very near-term performance, despite what the lawyers like to put at the bottom of the indicators. Otherwise, momentum wouldn't be a money-winning strategy. And there is a momentum component to ESG-ness in that perspective. The more money that goes in, the more it rises. The more people notice it, the more money goes in. There is a virtual spiral here, upward spiral that our research, based on all those different vendors, has shown that is a real effect. Much more so in Europe than in the US, much more so. Right? Europe is probably about 10 years ahead of the US in terms of outperformance of high ESG scoring. But that interpretation, I think, is an incredibly important thing for people to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and please.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that momentum argument is really, really important. I think there is momentum, and actually, on some levels, what is it that policymakers and those of us that are interested in growing this market, we're actually also trying to get momentum behind these investments, because for a very long time, companies taking these things seriously were regarded as wasting their time and focusing management time and effort on something that didn't matter. And it's about actually identifying and sort of demonstrating this does matter. This is important. And I think what you were beginning to touch on was, I think we had a question from the audience, Lizzie, if you don't mind me, you can be kind of looking at it, because there was a the question is about, if an ESG score shows a low ESG risk, can that same score be used to say it's a good company for the planet? And it's about, then we're starting to talk about risks on the one hand and impacts on the other. It's a very interesting question, because the ESG risks to a company may not necessarily relate in any way to the impacts. The impact that a company has on something. At the moment, for example, if your company bought a car or a bus, it could just turn it on and those emissions go into the air with basically no consequence whatsoever to that company. And so there's an awful lot of impacts that companies can have that are not currently risks, unless you start looking at the sort of slightly longer time horizons. And it's about the time horizon you start to look at, because as far as we look at it, risks eventually become impacts. Impacts eventually become risks. You cannot keep doing things the way you're doing it, if it's having a very negative impact, without it eventually becoming something that perhaps the government might stop, or customers may turn around and say, we don't want this anymore. One of the examples, it's not even a climate example, which is nice, was in the UK, we've got the Deliveroo, which is a kind of delivery, like Uber Eats type company that delivers food, with people on bikes earning extremely low amounts of money to deliver food to people. It did an IPO last year, and a whole load of investors spurned that IPO, which I think took quite a lot of analysts by surprise. And the reason they did it is because they do not, one of the key reasons, they do not think that business model where you paid, the entire profitability, the whole company hinges around the fact that for a very long time to come, it can continue to pay people in the gig economy very, very low wages to go and take food to people. And of course, we know that there are regulatory, legal, customer-related reasons why that might not be a viable business model for perpetuity. And so, looking at the fact that there's a negative impact, paying people extremely low wages, eventually becomes a business risk. That, I think, is a key example. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting question from your audience member.
So James, does that fit the S category for social or the G category for good governance?
I think
my answer is both.
Yeah, it's both, for sure.
Right.
I think,
But
I think
that kind of nuance, I think that you need to have this level of conversation, right? We're 39 minutes into the conversation, getting down to the meat of how does one interpret the 3 levels, 4 levels down in terms of ESG. That's why I think increased transparency to end investors, ultimately to retail investors, really is what's going to drive this, right? I mean, once upon a time, 50 years ago, the question was, is that a good stock or is that a bad stock? Should I invest in that stock or should I not invest in that stock? Yes or no. One answer, one number. Right. Today, retail investors talk about things like quality, like momentum, like earnings growth. I mean, that's 3 levels down, right? We're talking industry, we're talking sector, we're talking fundamental equity factor based on an academic paper from 1992, right? I mean, that's the level of sophistication I believe that we will get to, and we will get to at an accelerated pace because of a lot of information flowing, people really looking at granular data, and again, the demographics, right? Young people want the details, the specifics, and the internet gives them that in spades. So I think we are all headed in that right direction.
It feels like this is kind of exactly what has prompted, well, lots of things have prompted a backlash, but this confusion maybe over kind of risk and impact. And I wonder if maybe, I think the way the way the EU thinks about it with this concept of double materiality, increasingly talking about kind of dynamic materiality. I wonder if maybe that's a clear direction that we need to go in with separating those out, because I think that they do eventually intertwine, right? But today possibly not. And I was speaking to a banker earlier this week about the political situation in the US in particular, and he was saying, I think that people are just getting frustrated that some people working in ESG are saying, oh, it's just about risk. I promise, it's just about risk. But actually, managing those risks means that you can have an impact, and that's where people have got kind of started pushing back against that. Angel, have you got a view on that?
Yeah, absolutely, and I believe we have been mentioning that, right? So in reality, as the BP example, just to take one, right? So you might be doing something in one dimension due to the risk assessment that might not be exactly aligned with the idea of impact. So when BP is moving their business to the green energy, is due to the impact, because definitely in the future they don't want to impact the world the way they are doing through the fossil fuels, or it's because they believe that there's going to be more money in that new industry, and the fossil fuels is going to be an old industry that is going to keep being lower and lower and smaller and smaller and disappear in the future, right? So of course both terms can be confused. What I believe is very important is to be, well, some of the things that we have mentioned before, right? First, quantitative, use data. So stop talking about opinions, because I don't know what is more important, that if you avoid opinions when you are talking about investments, because you depend on that money for your future, or you are talking about opinions where you are talking about impact, because that is the future of the whole world. We shouldn't use opinions in any of the two, because two are very serious things for you personally and for the world and for your children and so on. So we should be very factual, working on the data to be sure that you can rely your judgments, your hypotheses, your assumptions in that data to make decisions. It is very important. We have a lot of tools today to make this possible and to complete and to challenge that data to be sure that you have the best quality and you're going to have the best judgment of everything, of the company, of the context, of the environment, of the society, and so on. And that's why we rely so much on artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on, not because those are fancy things, because those are simply measurements or ways to measure how things are, right? And that is the very first thing. Secondly, is about what is the methodology that you use. We were suggesting today. So if you want to measure risk, you need to have this approach. We work pretty closely, for example, to Professor Rigobon at MIT, one of the most famous paper about the discrepancies across the different scores coming from different companies. And that is super clear. There are different views, but that is not necessarily bad. So because based on the same data, or even in this case, even based on different data, putting different metrics into the buckets, is very likely that you're going to have different views. You can pick one, you can pick all of them, you can build your own, which is kind of what we provide to the market, right? It's more, you are a professional investor, you should have a judgment about the risk of the companies, and what you have to have in hand, or at hand, sorry, is a tool to basically do this analysis. And you need to have the methodology to translate this into what you want to measure exactly. If this is risk, it's going to be about a right process to have an analysis of the materiality, a way to customize the materiality for you, a way to decide how do you want to treat the data when there's a gap of the data, or if you want to include estimates of the data that is missing, and evaluate the quality of those estimates, taking into consideration what has been considered there. All these data points, so these are the ones that we provide to make this possible. Or if you are doing on the impact side, you need to be very sure about what impact means. Because, by the way, this is the way that you need to communicate to your clients. Damien was mentioning before about how much money goes to ESG funds in one place or another. I would love to understand better the reasons, because not even when young people invest in these companies or in these funds have the truth. And as you say, so the conversation can get deeper because people might have better judgment, better context, better knowledge. And that's why we need to be very clear about, if you invest in this fund, forget about the ESG concept, because that is too big. It might be not even an ESG fund, and it could be very impactful in the positive terms, because the ones that are creating that fund are taking into consideration all those dimensions. So what I ask asset managers, fund managers, is like, clarify this. First, because it's going to be good for the clients. You're going to be able to communicate very clearly what is your purpose with that fund. Secondly, because you're going to be avoiding getting into these greenwashing acquisitions, because maybe you are not very well doing it, and that is going to be much better for everybody. And you need to have the tools, which is the third dimension that I believe is important, like the technology itself, to put all these pieces together to make these decisions and analysis quickly in an effective and efficient way, right? Because as we have been saying, there are millions of data points that you can take into consideration. More even so, if you take into consideration non-structured data, as we do about analyzing news, analyzing satellite images, analyzing unstructured data across the society, that can let you put together dots that give you a better picture of the company. So these three dimensions, so having the right data, having the right methodologies, having the right tools, and with that, use it in good faith to either understand the risk dimension or understand the impact dimension and communicate it accordingly to your stakeholders. It could be your customers, it could be the companies that you invest in, and so on, is for us the key to clarify this market, make this better for the industry, financial industry in particular, and eventually make it better for the world, of course.
Thank you. I do just want to remind the audience, please do submit questions if you have any. We should have some time at the end to answer some. So I'm conscious that you are all kind of speaking to clients and members really regularly about all of these issues. So I did want to open it out to all three of you about kind of the sense you get about what's changed over the past 6 months to a year. Is this just kind of noise in the background, or are clients, members asking, is this going to have a bigger impact? Do we really need to be thinking about ESG? Is it just a trend? Or are the wheels already in motion?
I'll start by saying I don't think anyone's asking, is it just a fad? Is it a trend? Yes, it's absolutely a trend. It's a long-term trend, but no one is really saying this is a fad. In my experience, I will say I think there's an interesting difference between asset owner clients and asset manager clients on our side, and the larger clients and the smaller clients. So there are lots of vendors out there producing scores. There's a wide variety. There's a variance to the scores for any one company. So the part of the confusion is, whom do you believe, right? because they're all professionals. They're all working really hard to assess. There's interpretations and differences between them. Some of our clients have taken, not just some, but a good chunk of clients have taken the approach of subscribing to typically one vendor, because the data is not free. It's not an immaterial cost. So they're not going to necessarily buy from 3 or 4 vendors, although some do, and doing their own assessments and overriding some of those numbers, because their opinions, well, we understand their methodology. We think this is the right way to do it here. There are not many vendors who are consolidators of other vendors' data. I do believe that Clarity takes that approach to kind of pick and choose. And in my opinion, this is just my personal opinion, the average of professional scores is typically more accurate than any one individual score on any topic, right? It's kind of the mean value theorem applied to finance, if you will. That said, clients, our clients are definitely looking at picking and choosing kind of which scores and being very dynamic in that process. So they're learning themselves as they go through. I think that's the most significant thing coming out in the last 6 or 12 months, is the level of depth that people are willing and are going to really get a handle on the ESG-ness, whether it's impact or risk or both. Because it impacts your upside, and it certainly also impacts your downside. So it's not an either or question. I think it's an and question.
Angel, James,
yeah. So yes, happy to jump in. So I completely agree on the idea. So this is a long-term trend, but rather than trend, what I would like to name it is like a new set of tools, new set of analysis to include in the understanding of the companies, right? So to what I said, so sometimes when unfortunately conversations get too opinionated, too close to what is my view about climate change, or how I trust scientific view or whatever, I prefer to change the topic. I don't talk anymore about ESG. I don't talk anymore about sustainability. I start talking about non-financial information, which is how I started, by the way, the conversation. It's like, so what we provide is information about all the things that you don't necessarily see in the financial statements of the company. Do you want to have more information to evaluate the companies that you're putting a lot of money in? It is hard to say no to that question, right? So this is why the way that I see this industry evolving. Of course, there are very important dimensions related to the sustainability, and this is essential to connect the dots very well. And part of, so you mentioned Derek Fancy before, and there are some other people making noise around that. In many cases, I agree, because basically what they say is that, guys, you are overselling connections. You are saying that by doing this, this is going to happen. And that is not necessarily true. That I agree in many cases. But the debate shouldn't be about that, because it's kind of like trying to break the basis because you don't agree on the level 4, right? It's like, no, never do that, right? So the basics are true. You need this information. Where you can disagree is in the consequences of that, and as Damien said, so this is new. We have been like 10, more than 15 years on this. So we have a space and time to improve, to have better judgments, to do better hypotheses, and so on. And it's great that there are many players around, many people talking about this to improve this. What to me is not in doubt and cannot be is that this is not an information that is useful to understand better companies. And hopefully we all together find the best connections to get the best of the companies. So investments are better, and to get the best for the world, but don't change in what I believe is the fundamentals of a new source of information to understand business.
And I think that's one of the key points is this data is just necessary now. You wouldn't make decisions without this data. And why wouldn't you? There's now this whole wealth of amazing information and data that's out there that can be useful for making long-term decisions. Why would you not use that? Why would you not think about that? I think the question then has to be that the data on its own is valuable. But even more valuable is an analysis of what that data actually means, and what so the question might be, okay, so this company's got high emissions, so what? and then it becomes a matter of doing an analysis and saying, okay, this company's got high emissions and it's based in the EU. And the EU looks like it's going to be tightening up its emissions regulations over the next 5-10 years. So, oh, hang on, big business risk there. Is that business taking account of that and thinking about how they're going to align with that? Okay, another example, this business has got high emissions and it's based, in a country that whose government isn't taking this seriously. Are they okay? Well, then it's a case of looking at the political situation. Is the government going to change it? So there's a whole load of analysis that then needs to be put on almost every one of those data points to actually get to some useful understanding of what this means for the company. What that, I guess, all comes back down to is the amount of analysis and intelligence that we're thinking about in this industry, which is almost more than any one company could possibly try and do. Even companies that have got loads of analysts and are really looking at this very closely. An example clearly is the geopolitical risk. A lot of people were taken by huge surprise with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a lot of money was lost. As those, the scale, I think the unexpected scale of sanctions came in, particularly from the US and Europe on against Russia, and the consequences of that, which on some levels, on hindsight, when you saw what happened in Crimea, you saw what happened in Georgia, you could kind of go, well, hang on, wasn't this highly predictable? I think, but what wasn't predictable was the policy response. And that, I think, is what's so important, is that this is not just about whether a company has high emissions. It's not just about whether a company is, the way the company is treating its workforce. It's about what that means for the governments and others that are responding to that. And that is why you can't just assume that companies are going to have a fairly kind of good glide slope down in their kind of valuations or activities down to 2040, 2050. You actually need to start thinking about, well, hang on a minute. If Germany tomorrow said that they were going to put a massive regulation on car manufacturers and this is what it was going to be, suddenly the valuation can go off a cliff overnight because of an announcement by government. And that is, to try and be the smartest guy in the room and the person that sold their stock at the peak of the market is not a strategy I would necessarily want my funds to be managed
under. Damien, I thought you were going to say something now. I'm not sure.
Well, sure. Lots of meat in that conversation, James. I think you gave a great example of how two different companies in two different environments, right? One may be manufacturing something where the regulation is tight in that country, another one where it's not so tight, where the one that pollutes more might have a higher ESG score because it's not going to be financially impacted by its government in its location, in its market, whereas the other one is. Right. So the level of granularity, again, back to the education and the transparency, I think that's the key part. I mean, we really are in a kind of the inflection point of the learning curve here, right? Let's also remember that a lot of the ESG data that's out there is self-reported by the companies. This is not, we now do have independent ESG ratings, if you will, right, scorers, but it's not like there's an entire accounting industry that is like both in Europe and in the US after the Depression came about, the laws about investor disclosures, right, where there's an independent accounting of the actual numbers. Right? We don't yet have that in ESG. We have independent assessors, credit ratings, if you will, but we don't have accounting rules taking ESG into consideration. That is a step that I think we're not too far away from, which will increase the transparency. It will increase the requirements around the world, and it will increase the, I hope it decreases the variance of the numbers, because that's part of standardization, right? The challenge now is we've got an exploding industry, lots and lots of interest in it, no standards, some standards. We're attempting standards, right? There's some regulatory standards, but we're kind of halfway through that maturation process. Teenage years are ugly. They're just, we all went through them. Some of us have children who have gone through them or are going through them. It's just a rough period. And that's kind of where we are in the maturation curve, I feel. So it's exciting. And we can look to examples of previous things that this industry has done and others have done to help go through that that process a little bit quicker. So I'll wrap up by saying I'm actually quite bullish on it, even from an American perspective.
I just wanted to. I'm very glad to hear that, Damien, and I like your analysis of the teenage years. Well, you've kind of gone past the kind of cute. Oh, aren't they cute little kid stage, and now into the kind of, oh god, there's a lot going on here and a lot of turmoil. But I think the key, one of the key things I want to just throw in is that hopefully those sustainability accounting standards are going to be developed, and the IFRS, which is the body that does the international accounting standards, has just created its International Sustainability Standards Board, which is trying to develop these sustainability standards. The challenge for us, or the interesting thing for us, is the question of, do you make them sufficiently bold that most countries don't need to build too much on top of them, thus creating a system that is broadly similar across every country in the world, which of course would be the goal. The danger is if you make them too bold, a whole load of countries won't sign up to them, and so you lose your objective of making these consistent across the world. That's a very careful balancing act that they've got to make. But they just published a consultation, and I think they got tens of thousands of responses to that. So it'll be very interesting to see how that moves forward. But my hope is that that's moving forwards at pace.
Yeah. Lots to be optimistic about, all in all, which is really good to hear, and a good way to end, I think. So thank you so much to you all for participating today. I think that was a fascinating discussion. Thank you also to our audience at home. You can watch back today's webinar whenever you like by logging back into the event platform and clicking the On Demand tab on the event homepage. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you.